Welcome back to the channel. I'm Harper Vance, and here we tell the stories of those who hold the line. Today, we're following Sergeant First Class Jodie Spencer, a combat veteran who survived 14 months of desert warfare and shrapnel fire. But she didn't know the real enemy was waiting inside her own front door. Imagine coming home to find your Purple Heart sold to a pawn shop, your identity stolen, and your legacy erased by a sister obsessed with vanity. Her family tried to discard her like trash, but they made a fatal tactical error. They forgot they were declaring war on a soldier trained to dismantle the enemy, piece by piece. This is a story of stolen valor and absolute retribution. Let's get to work. The heavy glass door of the Greyhound bus hissed open, releasing a cloud of white exhaust into the biting Pennsylvania air. I stepped down onto the cracked asphalt of the suburban gas station, my boots making a hollow thud that felt far too loud in the quiet morning. The cold was different here than the dry, searing heat of the base I'd called home for the last 14 months. It was a damp, creeping chill that seeped through the layers of my fatigue-worn uniform, a constant reminder that I was no longer in the desert. I adjusted the strap of my duffel bag, the weight of it pulling at my shoulder, containing every scrap of the life I had lived while away. My medals, a few sand-caked books, and the heavy silence of survival. For months, the thought of this moment had been my North Star. I had closed my eyes during sandstorms and pictured the warm, oak-scented air of my parents' living room and the smell of my mother's cinnamon apple pie cooling on the counter. I had imagined my father's firm, prideful nod, the kind of silent validation I had spent my entire life chasing. But as I stood there, looking at the familiar tree-lined street, a strange, hollow knot began to tighten in my chest. I walked the 3 blocks to my childhood home, my footsteps rhythmic and mechanical, a habit born of years in the service. When the house finally came into view, it looked the same, yet entirely different. The white siding was pristine, the lawn manicured to a degree that felt aggressive, but as I reached the porch, I noticed the front door was unlocked. I pushed it open, expecting the familiar creak of the floorboards, but my boots met something cold and unyielding. The warm oak I remembered had been stripped away, replaced by polished white marble that felt like the lobby of a high-end hotel. Immediately, I tripped over a mountain of pink cardboard boxes and glossy shopping bags from designers I only recognized from magazines. The hallway was a minefield of luxury, a chaotic display of wealth that felt like a slap in the face to the dirt and grit I had just left behind. Mom appeared from the kitchen, draped in a silk Hermes scarf that probably cost more than my monthly combat pay. She didn't run to me. She didn't cry. She didn't even drop the silver spoon she was holding. Instead, she froze, her eyes scanning my rumpled, dust-stained uniform with a look of mounting irritation, as if I were a muddy dog that had wandered into a gallery. "Oh, Jodie, you're back," she said, her voice thin and distracted. "Be careful with that heavy bag, honey. The marble is new and very expensive. Don't scratch it." She leaned in for a brief clinical hug, the kind of embrace you give a distant relative at a funeral, before pulling back to wipe a stray speck of dust from her sleeve. My father didn't even look up from the tablet in his lap, his eyes glued to the flickering red and green lines of the stock market. He gave a curt nod in my general direction, a gesture so dismissive it made the 14 months I'd spent defending his world feel like a weekend trip to the grocery store. The knot in my chest turned into a cold, hard stone. I needed to lie down, to find the one place in the world where I was supposed to belong. I climbed the stairs, my bag feeling heavier with every step, my mind searching for the sanctuary of my bedroom, the posters of the national parks, my old wooden desk, and the framed photos of my unit. But when I pushed open the door, I didn't see my life. I saw a stage. My room had been gutted, transformed into a blindingly bright studio drenched in neon pink lights that hummed with artificial energy. A massive sign on the wall glowed with the words, "Chloe Vance Collection." My desk was gone, replaced by ring lights and sleek white shelves displaying rows of overpriced handbags. My past, my achievements, and my very identity had been erased to make room for my sister's latest vanity project. "Chloe needs the space for her brand launch, Jodie." "We didn't think you'd mind." My mother's voice floated up the stairs, sounding more defensive than apologetic. She suggested I could sleep on the sofa in the living room, mentioning it like she was doing me a favor by letting me stay at all. I was a soldier, a daughter, a person who had bled for the country they lived in, and yet I was being treated like an uninvited guest in the house I grew up in. Then Chloe walked in, wrapped in a silk robe, her face a mask of practiced indifference. She looked at my uniform, her lip curling in a way that made me feel smaller than I ever had in the face of enemy fire. "Look at you," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that only a sibling can master. "That outfit is hideous. It looks like a cheap costume for a background extra in a war movie." She didn't ask how I was, or if I was okay. She just told me I needed to park my old, beat-up truck down the street because it was ruining the aesthetic of the driveway and taking up space for her new SUV. That night, I lay on the sofa, the white linen fabric feeling cold and sterile against my skin. The house was silent, filled with the expensive things my parents and sister valued more than the person lying in their living room. I realized then that I wasn't the hero returning from the front lines. I wasn't the daughter coming home to open arms. I was a glitch in their perfect, curated reality. I was an intruder in my own home, a ghost of a life they had already decided to move on from. The air in the house felt thinner than the air in the desert, and for the first time in years, I felt truly, utterly alone. The silence of the house pressed down on me more heavily than the combat gear I had worn for the last 14 months. Laying there on the cold white sofa in the middle of the living room, I stared up at the ceiling and listened to the rhythmic hum of the designer wine fridge in the kitchen. Everything about this place felt foreign. Even the air was filtered and scentless, devoid of the lived-in warmth I had carried in my memories. I kept asking myself, if I don't stand up for my own worth, who in this house ever will? The question felt like a lead weight in my stomach, dragging me back through the years to all the moments I had allowed myself to be pushed into the shadows. This wasn't just about a room being turned into a studio. It was about a map of scars that had been etched into my soul long before I ever stepped onto a battlefield. I remembered the day I graduated from officer candidate school. It was a crisp morning, and the parade ground was filled with the families of my fellow soldiers, their cheers echoing against the brick buildings. I stood in my dress blues, my back straight, my eyes scanning the crowd for the two faces that mattered most. But all I found was a text message on my phone from an hour earlier. My mother had written that Chloe had a high school fashion showcase that same afternoon, and they simply couldn't make the drive. "You are so strong, Jodie. You don't really need us there like Chloe does," the message had read. That phrase had become the curse of my life. Because I was strong, I was the one who could be ignored. Because I was resilient, I was the one who was expected to celebrate my own milestones in a vacuum of silence while they doted on the golden child who crumbled at the slightest hint of effort. Over the last 8 years of my service, I had lived a life of extreme discipline and quiet sacrifice. While my peers were buying new trucks or spending their leave in Vegas, I was eating MREs in the mud and sleeping in freezing trenches, counting every cent of my combat pay. Every month, like clockwork, I sent a significant portion of my salary home. I did it because my father told me the mortgage was crushing them, that the family home was at risk. I felt a sense of duty, a pride in knowing that my struggle was providing them with security. But as I looked around that marble-clad hallway tonight, the truth tasted like ash. My sweat-drenched paychecks hadn't gone toward the mortgage. They had funded Chloe's luxury vacations, her designer handbags, and the very neon signs that now glowed in my former bedroom. I wasn't their daughter. I was a glorified ATM in a uniform, a tool used to subsidize the shallow vanity of an ego that knew no bounds. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, watching my mother prepare a tray of organic tea for Chloe with a level of tenderness I had never experienced. She carefully checked the temperature, her face etched with concern because Chloe had mentioned a slight headache from her live stream the night before. My mother looked over her shoulder at me, and for a second, her eyes landed on the jagged, silver scar peeking out from the collar of my t-shirt. A souvenir from a shrapnel blast that nearly took my arm. She didn't ask how it happened or if it still ached when the weather turned cold. Instead, she frowned and told me not to stand there staring because it made me look scary and intense. The service I had given, The friends I had buried and the physical toll my body had taken were just inconveniences to her, unsightly reminders of a reality she didn't want to acknowledge in her curated world. The memories of past Thanksgivings began to bleed into my mind, vivid and painful. I was always the one in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing the grease off the roasting pans while Chloe sat at the center of the table, showing off her latest social media metrics to my beaming father. He would talk about how proud he was of Chloe's reach and her eye for aesthetic, while I sat at the corner of the table in my fatigues, barely more than a footnote in the conversation. "You're the good kid, Jodie. You know how to take care of yourself," he would say whenever I tried to speak. It was his way of silencing me, of justifying why I deserved less of their time and less of their heart. My independence had been weaponized against me, turned into a reason to leave me behind. Lying back on that sofa as the sun began to peek through the expensive drapes, I realized that the wounds on my body were nothing compared to the void where my family's love should have been. I was a falcon that had been raised in a chicken coop, told to clip my wings so the others wouldn't feel intimidated by my flight. The Bible says that those who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength and mount up with wings like eagles. And for the first time, I understood that I couldn't fly as long as I stayed in this house. The map of injustice was clear now, every road leading to the same realization. I was alone, and I would have to be the one to save myself. I know how it feels to give everything to people who only see you for what they can take. It's a lonely road, especially when those people are your own flesh and blood. If you've ever felt like the strong one who was forced to carry the family's burdens while they looked right through you, please leave a small heart or just type the word "seen" in the comments. Let's remind each other that our value isn't defined by those who refuse to see it. Please like and comment to help me keep sharing this journey with you. The house was draped in a silence so thick it felt suffocating, a sharp contrast to the constant, underlying hum of a military base. It smelled of expensive vanilla candles and the kind of artificial perfection that makes you want to check your boots for mud before you even step inside. I couldn't sleep on that white sofa. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the phantom weight of my gear and the memory of sand biting into my skin. Around 2 a.m., I decided to stop fighting the insomnia and do what I had been wanting to do since I walked through the door. I needed to see the one thing that proved I had existed before this house was scrubbed of my history. I stood up quietly, my movements still governed by the muscle memory of a soldier moving through a dark compound, and headed toward my old room. The door to the Chloe Vance collection studio was unlocked. Inside, the pink neon lights cast long, eerie shadows over the mannequins draped in sequins and silk. It was a kingdom of vanity built on the ruins of my childhood. I didn't care about the posters they had torn down, or the desk they had thrown away. I was looking for a small, heavy wooden box I had tucked into the back of my closet before my last deployment. I found it shoved under a rack of glittery evening gowns, covered in a thin layer of dust and discarded garment bags. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled it out. This box wasn't just wood and velvet, it held my blood, my sacrifice, and the memory of brothers who never made it back to a bus station. But when I flipped the latch and opened the lid, my breath hitched in my throat. It was empty. My purple heart and my bronze star were gone, leaving behind nothing but the faint indentation in the blue velvet lining where they used to rest. For a moment, the world went cold. The military teaches you how to handle a physical ambush, but it doesn't prepare you for your own sister looting your soul. I didn't panic. I went into investigation mode, my mind narrowing down to the cold, hard facts of the situation. I began to search the room with a methodical precision that would have made my commanding officer proud. I checked the drawers of Chloe's sleek white vanity, moving past the expensive lipsticks and designer perfumes. In a drawer marked "Important," tucked under a stack of glossy business cards, I found a small slip of paper. It was a receipt from E's Cash Pawn in suburban Pennsylvania, dated just 3 weeks ago. The item was listed as U.S. military medals. The amount paid was exactly $2,000. The signature at the bottom, written in loopy, practiced cursive, belonged to Chloe Vance. The rage that surged through me wasn't the hot, blinding kind. It was the icy, focused anger of a person who has finally seen the bottom of a dark well. I grabbed the empty box and the receipt, my boots thudding heavily on the marble stairs as I headed toward the kitchen. The lights were already on. My parents and Chloe were sitting at the breakfast bar, looking like a scene from a catalog with their matching lattes and Sunday magazines. They looked so peaceful, so untouched by the reality of what it takes to earn the things they took for granted. I walked to the center of the room and slammed the empty box onto the stone counter, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the pristine space. I dropped the pawnshop receipt right on top of it. "Explain this," I said, my voice low and dangerous. Chloe didn't even flinch. She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. She took a slow sip of her drink, looked at the receipt, and then looked at me with an expression of bored annoyance. "Oh, Jodie, don't be so dramatic. You're always making everything about you," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Those little metal stars were just sitting in a closet gathering dust. I needed a bridge loan for the manufacturing of my new line, and those metals provided the capital to get us started. It was an investment in the family business, and honestly, you should be happy you could finally contribute something useful to this house. She said it with the kind of casual cruelty that only someone who has never bled for anything can manage. I looked at my father, waiting for the man who used to talk about honor and duty to stand up and demand an explanation. But he didn't even look away from his tablet. "Jodie, your sister is on the verge of something big, and you know you're the strong one. You can always earn more medals if they mean that much to you," he muttered, his voice devoid of any real weight. My mother stepped in then, her face a mask of patronizing concern. "Don't be selfish, dear. Chloe is under a lot of pressure, and we all have to make sacrifices for her dream. We'll pay you back eventually, once the brand takes off, so just let it go for the sake of peace in this family." Standing there, I realized that my family had been treating my life like a commodity for years. They didn't see the Purple Heart as a symbol of the shrapnel that had torn through my shoulder. They saw it as $2,000 toward a marketing campaign. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a resource to be harvested until there was nothing left but an empty box. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound I had ever sustained. I had survived the desert only to be picked clean by the people who were supposed to be my harbor. I picked up the receipt and the empty box, my heart hardening into something as cold as the marble under my feet. Abraham Lincoln once said that he didn't care if a person fell. He only cared if they stood back up, and in that moment, I knew I was standing. I wasn't just going to survive this homecoming. I was going to reclaim what was mine, even if I had to tear this house apart to do it. I walked out of the kitchen without another word, the sound of my mother telling Chloe she needed more cream in her coffee fading behind me as I began to plan my next move. I had been fighting for a country that didn't know my name, but now I was going to fight for the one person who did. Myself. I pulled my old truck out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the pristine gravel that felt more like a barrier than a path home. Behind me, the house glowed with that artificial, perfect light, still smelling of my mother's expensive vanilla candles and the suffocating scent of 1,000 small lies. Every breath I had taken in that living room felt like it was clogging my lungs, reminding me of the toxic dust and smoke from the burn pits I had survived overseas. Pennsylvania at night was a different kind of cold, a biting, damp chill that seeped into the metal of the cabin. But it was nothing compared to the absolute frost in my father's eyes when I had demanded the truth. I drove toward the outskirts of Pittsburgh, my hands steady on the wheel, but my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stopped in front of a small weathered timber house, a place that didn't have a manicured lawn or a designer nameplate, but it had a porch light that felt like a lighthouse in the dark. Marcus Reed didn't ask why I was standing on his doorstep at 2 a.m. with red rims around my eyes and a heavy wooden box tucked under my arm. He didn't ask for an explanation or a reason. He just stepped aside, opened the door wide, and handed me a mug of coffee that was black, bitter, and exactly the way we used to drink it in the motor pool. "Welcome home, Sergeant," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that carried more weight than anything my parents had said to me since I stepped off that bus. In that moment, the realization hit me like a physical blow. Home wasn't the place where my name was on a birth certificate or where my childhood photos used to hang before they were replaced by fashion sketches. Home was the place where people understood the cost of the scars you carried and didn't look away when they saw the intensity in your eyes. I set the empty wooden box on his scarred kitchen table and told him everything about Chloe, the pawnshop receipt, and the casual way my parents had dismissed the theft of my honor. Marcus was a man made of steel and quiet discipline, a veteran who had walked through the worst fires the world had to offer. And I watched his hands tremble as I explained the $2,000 price tag on my Purple Heart. "Jodie, this isn't just a family dispute," he growled, his eyes darkening with a cold, focused fury. "This is stolen valor. It is a federal crime to profit from the medals of a service member like this, and it is a betrayal of every person who ever wore the uniform." He touched the empty velvet lining of the box with more reverence than my mother had shown me in a decade. Seeing a stranger, a brother in arms, value my sacrifice so deeply was a sharp, painful contrast to the utter indifference of the people who shared my blood. Marcus sat down at his computer, his fingers moving across the keys with the practiced speed of the cybersecurity expert he had become after leaving the service. The room was silent except for the clicking of the keys and the hum of the heater, but the atmosphere was thick with a mounting dread. After 10 minutes, he stopped, his face hardening into a mask of grim determination that I had only seen in combat. "Jodie, the medals are just the tip of the iceberg," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he turned the monitor toward me. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring as I saw my own name, Jodie Spencer, attached to dozens of high-interest credit accounts opened over the last 8 months. Chloe hadn't just sold my medals. She had systematically dismantled my entire financial life, using my military credentials and my power of attorney to rack up over $120,000 in debt. She had been living a life of luxury on my credit, buying the very clothes and bags that were currently littering my old bedroom while I was sleeping in the dirt half a world away. "There is more," Marcus said, his voice full of a dark warning that made my stomach churn with a sudden, sharp nausea. He pulled up a PDF document, a legal filing for my parents' house in the Midwest, the very home I'd been sending my paychecks to protect for the last 8 years. Chloe had used a forged signature to turn that house into collateral for a high-risk investment fund to back her brand. The loan was in default. The payments were months behind, and in exactly 60 days, the sheriff would be at the door to evict my parents. I looked at the digital trail of her betrayal, realizing that while she was planning her glamorous trip to Milan, she was leaving behind a smoldering ruin of a family. She had sold our history, stolen our future, and left me holding the legal and financial bag for all of it. The silence in Marcus's kitchen was absolute as I realized that the war wasn't over. The battlefield had just shifted to my own front door. I drove back to the house as the sun began to climb over the horizon, the golden light of a Pennsylvania morning doing little to thaw the ice that had formed around my heart. I kept asking myself if they had even a single shred of conscience left, or if the people I called family had been replaced by hollow shells of vanity. The question felt like a lead weight as I walked through the front door, the heavy silence of the house greeting me like an old, unwanted friend. I walked into the kitchen to find my mother busy at the stove, the air thick with the rich, savory scent of a traditional American pot roast. It was the kind of smell that was supposed to mean safety and comfort, the aroma of onions, carrots, and slow-cooked beef that had defined my childhood Sundays. But today it felt like bait in a trap, a beautiful mask covering the rot underneath. Chloe was already seated at the island, her eyes glued to her phone as she scrolled through Instagram, her face lit by the artificial glow of 1,000 filtered lives. No one asked where I had been all night. No one asked if I was okay after the explosion in the kitchen the night before. My mother simply placed a plate in front of me with a sharp click of porcelain against stone, her voice tight with a frustration she didn't bother to hide. She told me I needed to learn how to behave and stop making things so difficult for Chloe, who was apparently exhausted from the stress of her new brand launch. I sat there, looking at the steam rising from the meat, feeling a cold knot of anger tightening in my chest. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper at first, but his presence felt like a judge presiding over a trial where the verdict had already been decided. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy, using the very language of the military to twist the knife deeper. He told me that as a soldier, I had been trained in the art of sacrifice, so he couldn't understand why I was being so small-minded about a couple of medals. He called the theft of my Purple Heart and Bronze Star a contribution, a necessary investment in the family's future. He spoke about the $2,000 Chloe had pocketed as if it were pocket change I should be happy to provide to help my sister achieve something great. It was a calculated assault on my values, an attempt to make my years of service and the blood I had shed feel like nothing more than a line item in Chloe's marketing budget. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, her lip curling in that familiar expression of practiced disdain that always made me feel like an outsider in my own skin. She told me I should be thanking her instead of complaining. She laughed, a sharp, hollow sound, and asked what good those metal stars were doing sitting in a dark box anyway. In her world, the only thing that mattered was the value of a like or a share, and she claimed she had turned my rusty old medals into something with real power in the modern world. To her, my sacrifice was just a commodity, a bit of content to be consumed and discarded once it had served its purpose. She looked at me not as a sister who had returned from a war, but as a failed investment that was suddenly demanding a dividend she had no intention of paying. The sheer arrogance of it was more nauseating than the smell of the battlefield, a level of betrayal that no amount of training could have prepared me for. My mother reached out and gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her expensive silk scarf fluttering as she leaned toward me. She didn't talk about the debt Marcus had shown me or the forged signatures that were about to cost them their home. She only talked about the family reputation and how my presence was starting to tarnish the image they had worked so hard to build. She gave me an ultimatum, her voice trembling with a fake sort of grief, telling me that if I couldn't find a way to be supportive of Chloe, then maybe this wasn't the place for me anymore. They were trying to exile me for the crime of noticing their lies, threatening to cast me out because I refused to play the role of the silent, suffering martyr any longer. They cared more about the porcelain veneer of their lives than the fact that their daughter was drowning in the financial ruin they had created in my name. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice or try to explain the figures I had seen on Marcus's screen. I sat there in a silence that felt as heavy as a loaded weapon, watching them through the eyes of a hunter who has finally seen the prey for what it truly is. I realized then that my enemy wasn't just Chloe and her greed. It was the two people sitting across from me who had enabled her to pick me clean while they smiled and served pot roast. Every word they spoke was another nail in the coffin of the relationship I had spent my life trying to save. I was no longer the daughter looking for a home. I was a soldier gathering intelligence, waiting for the right moment to strike back and reclaim the life they thought they could just give away. The dinner continued in a suffocating peace, but underneath the surface, the war had already begun. And I was the only one who knew the true cost of the battle that was coming. I stood up from the dining table, the chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a blade being sharpened. I was no longer the daughter trying to earn a seat at this table. I was a sergeant first class identifying a threat in the wire. I looked Chloe directly in the eyes, ignoring the designer silk and the expensive makeup that hid the rot underneath. "Chloe," I said, my voice dropping into that low-level tone used for briefing commanders before a mission. Selling military medals and forging signatures on loan documents are federal crimes. I have the evidence of the stolen valor and the $120,000 in debt you racked up in my name. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to go back to that pawn shop, buy back my Purple Heart and Bronze Star, and confess the truth to the bank. If you don't, I will contact the military police and the local authorities. The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the expensive wine fridge. For a second, a flicker of genuine terror crossed Chloe's face, but it was quickly eclipsed by the shadow of my parents. They didn't look at Chloe with disappointment. They looked at me with a hatred that was cold and absolute. My mother screamed that I was cold-blooded, accusing me of trying to throw my own sister in prison over what she called a misunderstanding. They were acting as human shields for the monster they had spent 20 years feeding. Chloe lunged then, her face contorted in a mask of narcissistic rage. "Who do you think you are?" she screamed, and then her hand connected with my cheek in a sharp, stinging slap. The sound echoed through the high ceilings of the kitchen. I didn't flinch, and I didn't strike back. I had survived mortar fire and IEDs. A slap from a spoiled child meant nothing to my body, but it meant everything to my soul. I stood there, feeling the heat on my skin, but my eyes were fixed on my parents. They stood there and watched. They saw their daughter, a veteran who had just returned from a war zone, be assaulted in their own home, and they didn't say a word to stop it. Their silence was the final confirmation. It was the sharpest blade they had, and with it, they finally severed the last thread of loyalty I held for them. My father didn't go to Chloe to scold her. Instead, he marched into the living room and returned with a large black industrial trash bag. He began to grab my military uniforms, my mud-caked boots, and the few mementos I had managed to keep, stuffing them into the bag with a violence that made my stomach churn. He shoved the bag into my chest with a look of pure disgust. "Get out!" he barked, his voice trembling with a misplaced sense of authority. "Go and calm down. Don't you dare come back to this house until you learn how to put this family before your own ego." He was throwing me out like garbage, treating my life of service as if it were an old, unwanted rug that was cluttering up his pristine marble hallway. My entire life, my honor, and my history were now contained in a single black plastic sack. I gripped the neck of the bag in one hand and my empty wooden box in the other. I walked out the front door without a single word of goodbye. The Pennsylvania night was thick with a heavy gray fog that swallowed the streetlights and hid the familiar landmarks of my youth. I didn't cry. My tears had been burned out of me a long time ago in places where crying could get you killed. As I walked toward my truck, I remembered the words that my unit chaplain had once shared about how a person's enemies will be the members of their own household. I had finally accepted the brutal reality of that truth. They wanted a war, and they thought they could win by casting me into the dark. But they forgot one thing. I am a soldier. I was trained to survive in the dark, and I was trained to win. I threw the trash bag into the back of the truck and felt the survival mode kick in, a cold, calculating clarity that took over my mind. This was no longer about family. This was about justice. I know that some of you watching this have felt that same sting, not just on your cheek, but in your heart, when the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones who handed you the trash bag. It is a pain that leaves a scar no one else can see. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic home just to save your own soul, please let me know you are out there. Just type the word heartbroken or the word enough in the comments so I know I am not alone in this fight. Your support means the world as I share this journey. Please like and comment to stand with me. The morning air at the regional army base was crisp and smelled of rain-soaked asphalt and gun oil, a scent that finally felt like reality after the suffocating vanilla of my parents' house. I walked through the security gates with a sharp, rhythmic stride, my boots clicking against the linoleum floors of the administrative building in a way that centered my mind. When I reached the office of Colonel James Miller, I did not hesitate. I stood at attention, my back a straight line of iron, and waited for the command to enter. Colonel Miller was a man who had seen 40 years of service, his face a map of the battles he had fought and the soldiers he had led. When I placed the thick file Marcus had compiled onto his mahogany desk, the silence in the room became heavy with an unspoken tension. He flipped through the pages slowly, his eyes narrowing as he saw the pawnshop receipts for my medals and the digital trail of identity theft and forged signatures. I watched his jaw tighten, a muscle jumping in his cheek as the full scope of Chloe's betrayal became clear. A soldier serving her country being stripped of her honor and her future by her own blood is an insult that the uniform cannot tolerate, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that echoed my own suppressed fury. He did not just see a family dispute, he saw a violation of federal law and the sacred bond of military service. He picked up the phone to alert the Criminal Investigation Division, but I stopped him with a single, steady look. I requested a 48-hour window to gather the final, undeniable evidence in person, to finish the mission in the place where it began. I told him I wanted the truth to come out during Chloe's engagement party, where the audience would be the very people she was trying to impress with her stolen wealth. He gave me a curt, respectful nod, granting me the tactical lead on an operation that was no longer about a daughter's love, but a sergeant's justice. I returned to my parents' house that evening, but I did not walk through the door as the defiant woman who had been kicked out with a trash bag. I put on a mask of brokenness, my shoulders slumped and my eyes downcast. playing the role of the daughter who had finally been crushed by the weight of her own isolation. Chloe was in the hallway, surrounded by boxes of expensive catering supplies and floral arrangements that smelled like a funeral from my childhood. She looked at me with a smirk that was pure, unfiltered arrogance, a look that confirmed she thought she had won. "So, the hero finally crawled back," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that would have made me flinch just 2 days ago. She told me I could stay for the weekend only if I acted as her personal assistant for the party, cleaning up the mess in her studio and staying out of the way of her important guests. She banned me from wearing my uniform, claiming it would ruin the elegant vibe of her brand launch. My mother and father watched from the kitchen, their faces showing a mixture of relief and a patronizing kind of pity, believing that I had finally learned my place. They did not see the tiny, high-definition recording devices tucked into the palms of my hands or the professional-grade audio sensors hidden in the folds of the old clothes I had brought back. I spent the next several hours moving through the house like a ghost, scrubbing floors and hauling boxes, all while strategically placing the eyes and ears of the federal government in the corners of their curated reality. As I worked in the studio, my former bedroom, the audio feed in my earpiece hummed with the sound of Chloe's real voice. I heard the sharp click of her heels as she entered the room with her fiancé, a man who looked at her with the blind devotion of someone who had never seen her without her filters. She began to laugh, a cold, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. She spoke about the trip to Milan, boasting about how the money from the loans and the pawned medals would fund their new life in Italy. She didn't talk about the brand or the business. She talked about the escape. I felt a surge of icy focus as she moved on to the topic of our parents. "When the bank finally takes this house," she said, her voice as indifferent as a winter storm, "I will just tuck them away into that state-run nursing home in the suburbs. It is cheap, out of sight, and they will be too confused to realize I was the one who signed the papers." Each word was a confirmation of the rot I'd sensed in her for years, a betrayal so absolute it eclipsed even the theft of my medals. She was not just a thief, she was a predator, ready to discard the very people who had protected her and sacrifice their other daughter to feed her ego. That night, I retreated to a small motel room near the base, the air smelling of stale tobacco and cheap cleaner, a space that felt infinitely more honest than the mansion I had just left. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled my dress blues out of their protective garment bag. I spent hours polishing the brass buttons until they shone like gold, and brushing the dark blue wool until not a single speck of dust remained. I thought about the old veteran Marcus had introduced me to, a man who told me that the real battlefield is often the place where your loyalty is tested to its breaking point. My family had made their choice. They had chosen the glitter of Chloe's lies over the substance of my truth. I felt a strange, quiet peace settle over me as I ironed the sharp creases into my trousers. I was no longer the girl with the black trash bag, shivering in the fog of betrayal. I was a soldier preparing for a final engagement, a sergeant first class putting on her armor for a mission that required the cold precision of the law. The engagement party was not going to be a celebration of Chloe's brand. It was going to be the theater of her downfall. I looked at my reflection in the dim motel mirror and saw a woman who had found her worth in the fires of adversity, ready to stand firm against the schemes that had tried to bury her. The crystal chandeliers of the rented mansion cast a shimmering, artificial glow over the sea of silk and expensive cologne as the jazz music hummed in the background. It was the kind of setting where reputation was everything, a curated theater of success designed to hide the rot beneath the surface. Chloe stood at the center of the room, draped in a designer gown that sparkled like the diamond she was about to display, her voice ringing out with a rehearsed warmth as she spoke of her brand and her love. I stood in the deep shadows of the hallway, wearing a plain server's apron over my clothes, carrying a tray of champagne that felt like a prop in a play I was about to end. My parents moved through the crowd with practiced smiles, their eyes sliding right over me whenever they passed as if I were a piece of the architecture they had already discarded. They truly believed they had won, that they had broken my spirit and turned their soldier daughter into a quiet servant for Chloe's crowning moment. I looked at my watch, the seconds ticking away with a cold, mechanical precision that matched the beating of my heart. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of expensive flowers and the hollow laughter of people who valued image over substance. At exactly 8:17 in the evening, just as Chloe raised her glass to toast the future she'd built on the ruins of my life, the heavy mahogany front doors were thrown open with a force that cut through the music. The room went dead silent as Colonel Miller stepped into the foyer, his dress blues immaculate and the rows of medals on his chest catching the light like a warning. He moved with an authority that commanded the air around him, followed by 4 federal agents in dark suits and 2 local police officers whose badges glinted under the chandeliers. Chloe's face froze in a mask of confusion and mounting dread as she demanded to know who they were, but Colonel Miller did not even blink. He looked at her with the cold, detached gaze of a commander addressing a traitor and announced that he was there to execute a federal arrest warrant for Chloe Vance. The gasp from the crowd was a collective intake of breath that felt like the snapping of a tension wire. I stepped out from the shadows of the corner and unfastened the server's apron, letting the black fabric fall to the marble floor like a discarded skin. Underneath, I was wearing my own dress blues, the fabric crisp and the brass buttons polished to a mirror shine. I walked forward to stand beside my colonel, my spine as straight as the truth I had carried alone for too long. I looked directly into Chloe's eyes, seeing the moment her arrogance finally shattered into 1,000 pieces of panic. Colonel Miller began to read the charges in a voice that was clear and unwavering, listing the identity theft of a service member, multiple counts of federal financial fraud, and the theft of government property. The sound of the metal handcuffs clicking around Chloe's wrists was a sharp, dry sound that echoed through the silence of the ballroom. Every pair of eyes in the room was now fixed on the golden child, as her polished reality was dismantled in front of the very people she had tried to impress. The final blow came when the lead agent turned toward my parents, who were standing frozen by the buffet, their faces pale and gaunt. He did not offer them comfort. Instead, he informed them that the house they were standing in was now part of a federal investigation into the fraudulent mortgage Chloe had secured using my forged signature. I watched the realization wash over them as they understood that the daughter they had protected had been the one ready to throw them into the street. Chloe's fiancé, a man who had been the centerpiece of her new life, looked at her once with a mixture of disgust and horror before quietly removing his ring and walking out the door. The guests began to scatter like shadows at sunrise, fleeing the mansion to avoid being associated with the wreckage of the Vance name. Chloe began to scream, her voice high and desperate, calling me a jealous failure who was trying to ruin her life, but the words had no weight anymore. I looked at her with a calm that was more powerful than her rage and told her that she would have plenty of time to work on her image behind bars. I walked out of that house with my head held high, the empty wooden box finally feeling light in my hands as the truth set me free. When the last of the police cruisers pulled away and the flickering blue and red lights finally faded from the windows, the mansion fell into a silence that was more terrifying than the shouting. The air, once thick with expensive perfume, and the hum of social climbing now felt cold and hollow like a tomb that had been freshly looted. My parents were no longer the proud judges of my character or the defenders of the golden child. They were just 2 broken people huddled together on the white marble floor, surrounded by the wreckage of a party that had turned into a crime scene. Half-empty champagne glasses sat on the counters, and gift boxes wrapped in silk ribbons looked like discarded trash in the wake of the federal agents. My mother began to wail a thin, high sound that lacked any real weight of grief for me. She was crying for the daughter she had lost to handcuffs, and for the massive debt that was now a ghost, haunting the rafters of this house. Between her sobs, she looked up at me with eyes full of a desperate, lingering resentment, asking why I could not have just told them sooner. She asked how I could be so cruel as to do this to my own sister in front of everyone they knew. Even now, with the truth laid bare in the form of arrest warrants and forged documents, she was searching for a way to make me the villain of her story. I looked down at them, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no desire for an apology, and certainly no urge to step forward and pull them up from the floor. I felt a strange and profound stillness, as if I were observing 2 strangers in a bus station rather than the people who had raised me. I told her very quietly that I did not say anything, because the conversation ended the moment my father handed me a black trash bag and told me to leave. I told her that when they treated my uniform and my life like refuse, They had already made their choice. The moment that plastic bag touched my chest, my loyalty to this bloodline died a quiet and final death. I explained that because of the federal investigation, the house would be frozen and they would have a chance to contest the fraudulent loans Chloe had taken out in my name. I told them I had provided the bank with the evidence they needed to protect their roof, but that this was the very last thing I would ever do as their daughter. It was not an act of love, but a closing of the books, a final settlement of a debt I no longer wished to carry. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that their strong child was no longer willing to be their shield. My father stood up slowly, his movements stiff and aged, as if the reality of the situation had added 20 years to his frame. He took a step toward me, reaching out a hand that had once pointed the way to my exile. He looked as if he wanted to place it on my shoulder to offer a word of apology or perhaps to ask for the strength he knew I possessed. But I took a single deliberate step back, and the boundary I drew in that moment was as unyielding as a reinforced bunker. I could see the flickers of calculation in his eyes, the realization that they needed me now more than ever to navigate the legal ruins Chloe had left behind. They wanted me to stay to be the dependable soldier who would march into the fire and pull them out of the mess they had allowed to happen. But a late apology is like a bandage on a wound that has already turned to bone. I realized that they did not miss me. They missed the convenience of my resilience. They did not want my heart, they wanted my labor and my credit score. I walked toward the hallway to gather the last of the things that actually belonged to me. I picked up the empty wooden box that used to hold my medals, a symbol of a life they had tried to pawn for a few months of luxury. I did not need the medal stars to know who I was, and I did not need their recognition to know the value of my service. As I walked back toward the front door, I saw them watching me from the kitchen, their faces pale and lost in the vastness of a house that no longer felt like a home. There was no black trash bag in my hand this time. I was walking out with my head held high and my spirit intact, carrying nothing but the dignity I had fought for in the mud of a foreign land and the silence of my own kitchen. I was choosing to go no contact, not out of spite, but out of a desperate necessity for peace. I was done being the scapegoat for a family that valued appearance over truth, and I was done begging for a seat at a table where I was only served crumbs. As I stepped out onto the porch, the fog of the previous nights had cleared, leaving the Pennsylvania air sharp and crystalline. The world looked different now, devoid of the filters and lies that had obscured my vision for so long. I realized that forgiveness did not mean I had to sit in the same room with the people who had tried to erase me. It meant I was finally letting go of the hope that they would ever change so that I could begin to live. I climbed into my truck and started the engine, the sound a steady roar that signaled the start of a journey they would never be a part of. I was the one who got to define my value now, and for the first time I felt like I was finally coming home to myself. The house in the rearview mirror grew smaller and smaller until it was just a pinprick of light in the darkness, and then it was gone. I was a soldier who had survived the war abroad and the war within, and I was finally walking into a sunrise that belonged to no one but me. 3 months had passed since that night the crystal chandeliers of the mansion shattered under the weight of the truth. I stood in a quiet courtroom in Pennsylvania, the air smelling of old paper and the heavy, sterile scent of institutional justice. Chloe sat at the defense table, her designer clothes replaced by a plain, dark suit that seemed to swallow her whole. She looked gaunt, her skin sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights, a ghost of the vibrant Instagram queen, who had once ruled that marble hallway with a flick of her wrist. The judge read the sentence for her federal crimes: identity theft of a service member and large-scale financial fraud. My parents sat in the row behind her, their shoulders hunched and their faces etched with a grief that had finally aged them beyond their years. They wept silently as the bailiffs led her away in handcuffs, a sound that no longer had the power to pierce my heart. They had managed to keep their house after the brutal legal battle Marcus and I had engineered to clear the forged mortgage, but as I looked at them, I knew the warmth of that home had vanished forever. I felt no joy in her downfall and no satisfaction in their tears. I only felt a quiet, heavy pity for a soul that had traded the gold of reality for the dross of digital illusions. A week later, I drove to the military evidence storage facility on a bright Midwest afternoon. The kind of day where the sunlight is so gold and crystalline, it feels like a promise. The officer in charge, a man who recognized the rank on my ID, with a respectful nod, handed me the familiar wooden box. Its surface was worn and smooth, carrying the silent history of the places it had traveled with me. When I opened the lid, the light caught the purple heart and the bronze star, and my eyes filled with tears I'd not let fall in years. They felt heavy in my palms, not because of the weight of the metal, but because of the weight of the memories they held. The brothers who stood beside me, and the sacrifice of those who never came home. These symbols had been sold for $2,000 at a pawn shop, treated like discarded junk by the people who shared my DNA, but now they were back in the hands of the person who had bled to earn them. I ran my thumb over the velvet lining, feeling a sense of profound closure that no court sentence or legal victory could ever provide. The empty box was finally full again, not just with medals, but with the dignity I'd fought so hard to reclaim. I did not move back to that house with the marble floors and the vanilla candles. Instead, I found a small apartment near the base, a space that smelled of cedar and fresh air, where I could hear the morning bugle calls that signaled the start of a new day. Together with Marcus Reed, I founded the Stand Fast Project. We built a network to provide legal and cybersecurity support for active duty service members who find themselves being financially exploited by their own families while they are deployed abroad. Every day, I look into the eyes of young soldiers who have been betrayed by the people they trusted most, and I tell them my story. I tell them about the black trash bag and the cold marble floor. And I see the moment the light of hope flickers back into their eyes. My pain has become a tool, a way to build a shield for others so they do not have to stand in the darkness of betrayal alone. I realize that my resilience was never a curse intended to make me a silent martyr. It was the foundation for a mission that actually matters. Tonight, I'm sitting on my balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon in a blaze of orange and purple. The wooden box sits on my bookshelf, flanked by a photo of my unit and a picture of Marcus and Colonel Miller, the people who stood by me when the world turned its back. I have realized that family is not a matter of destiny or a contract signed in blood. It is a choice made every single day based on respect, honor, and the courage to be truthful. The strength of a soldier is not just found in the ability to withstand enemy fire. It is found in the quiet, iron-willed courage to draw a line in the sand and protect your own soul from those who would pick it clean. I lost a house built on lies and vanity, but I found a home built on the bedrock of self-respect and truth. The sun is coming up on a life I have defined for myself, and for the first time, I am not an intruder or a guest. I am exactly where I am supposed to be, standing in the light of a sunrise that belongs to no one but me. Jodie's journey reminds us that our personal value does not depend on recognition from our family. In many households, there is a silent pressure to endure toxicity for the sake of peace, but your individual resilience and effort remain your most valuable assets. True strength lies in the courage to set firm boundaries with toxic relationships, even when it feels like a betrayal of tradition. We must remember that family can be redefined through shared respect and honor rather than just bloodlines. Taking a stand is not about malice, but about the necessary recovery of your own dignity and the pursuit of internal peace. I am Harper Vance, and I want to thank you for joining me on this deeply emotional path. Stories like Jodie's are meant to provide a sense of catharsis and validation for anyone who has ever felt like an outsider in their own home. If you found a soul connection in Jodie's resilience, please share your story or a word of encouragement in the comments section below. Your interaction helps us build a community where no one has to feel alone in their struggle. Please like and share this story to help spread this message of strength and healing to those who need it most. Have you ever had to find your own version of a chosen family?